Welcome to this Lunch and Learn event. Thank you all so much for being here today. This event is hosted by the Bennion Community Service Center and the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence in this wonderful space. Let's please give CTLE a hand. They've also provided this wonderful lunch, so thank you, Pat and CTLE.
Thank you.
Our true
calling.
accomplishment.
I'm Kimberly Mangan. I work at the Bennion Center, and my role is to help faculty across campus integrate community-engaged learning into new or existing classes. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Communication, where I teach a journalism class that is CEL designated. The panelists and I are absolutely delighted to see so many committed educators here today from disciplines as diverse as theater, pediatrics, education, and biology. As a gesture of our appreciation for your attendance today, we have drawn a name for a door prize, and today it is Teresa Molina.
Yay. A door prize? This is awesome.
That's great. They did have a door prize.
So I'm very pleased to introduce today's panelists. Hank Liese is Dean of the College of Social Work. He has received numerous honors during his career at the U, including the Outstanding Faculty Award from the Center for Disability Services and the Public Service Professorship from the Bennion Center. He has written about topics including civically engaged scholarship and the civically engaged scholar and the RPT process. Keith Diaz Moore is Dean of the College of Architecture and Planning. He is a registered architect who is a passionate advocate of the connection between culture, health, and place, particularly in the area of design for older adults experiencing dementia. Keith is a recipient of the Architecture for Social Justice Award, which was inspired by a Carnegie Foundation report that urged architecture schools to foster a climate of caring for human needs by including more frequent contact with clients and communities. Our third speaker today is Amy J Wildermuth, who serves as the Associate Vice President for Faculty. In that role, she oversees a variety of university personnel issues, such as faculty review and development. Amy also is an award-winning educator who teaches in the College of Law and writes on administrative law, civil procedure, environmental law, and U.S. Supreme Court practice. I've asked the panelists to try to limit the remarks to about 15 minutes because I'm sure that you'll have lots of questions for the panelists. And now I'll ask Hank to lead us off.
Thank you, Kim. I feel a little self-conscious with this microphone on. I feel like I should be on the sidelines of the Super Bowl or something, and that when I talk about what I do, I have to hold this up, you know, so you know, like coaches do when they have their playbook and they don't want you to read their lips. But anyway, it's already fallen out once, so hopefully it won't happen again, and I'll get through this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history from my vantage point of service, what was then we called service learning and civically engaged scholarship. And there's some colleagues here that go back as far as I'm going to go back. Marty, Cheryl, where's Marissa Diener? Okay, back to the early days. Okay, we're going to kind of review that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience with the RPT process and how I kind of went out on a limb and decided, this was back in '02, to present myself to the world as, well, actually to my RPT advisory committee and the senior VP and president as a civically engaged scholar. And then I'm going to finish up talking about the progress I've seen that's going on today, and it's actually a nice segue into what Keith is going to talk about. I came here in 1993, and the very next year found myself on the Bennion Center Advisory Board, and as it turns out, I've worked with and collaborated with 4 different Bennion Center directors. It's sort of like, you know, you often hear politicians say, I've worked under 4 administrations, you know, Nixon, Ford, and well, I've had the pleasure of working with Irene Fisher, Marshall Welch, Linda Dunn, and now Dean McGovern. And in the early years, we were focused primarily on service learning, which we now call community engaged learning. That primarily, and then in time, and I'll talk a little bit about this, we started focusing on what we then called civically engaged scholarship. Now, I think we refer to community engaged scholarship. We had, back in the day, we had Irv Altman involved. Irv was a professor of psychology and a former senior VP. There was a committee that Irv headed up called WOW, the WOW Committee, and I'm never sure if that was an acronym, but when I asked Irv about it once, he said, well, we just wanted it to have impact. So what better way to name a committee than the WOW Committee? That was followed by a committee that I chaired for a time called the Futures Committee. And the WOW and the Futures Committee initially focused on institutionalizing service learning here at this university. And it was, in the beginning, kind of an uphill battle, but Irene Fisher had a lot to do with bringing the Bennion Center into national prominence as being a center that was doing service learning and doing it well. The Futures Committee gave seed grants to departments and colleges to develop service learning courses, to what we called institutionalization. And some of you may remember, if you worked during that time, that the hope was, as with all seed funding, that the departments would eventually take it over. Well, you know, that just didn't happen, and we kept giving seed money to keep things going. But something took hold, and I think service learning, now community engaged learning, is well established here at the university. So we began, I think in the early 2000s, to focus more on community engaged scholarship. We formed a group called the Civically Engaged Scholars Group, and there were about a dozen faculty, some PhD students who met every other week for a couple hours over a 2-year period, and we were focusing on the kind of research that we were involved in and felt was very important, community engaged scholarship. One of the things, we even came up with a definition of civically engaged scholarship, and this, hope this isn't stealing any of your thunder. Civically engaged scholarship is a dynamic and collaborative participatory process in which the rich resources of the university and community are combined to integrate research, learning, and service in identifying and addressing community-based issues and needs while promoting socially responsible knowledge. Faculty, staff, students, and members of the community forge relationships as meaningful partners in exploring those practices that produce tangible outcomes to benefit the partners in their communities and that disseminate new knowledge in a variety of ways. And then we began to look at RPT statements. What were RPT statements here at this university saying about service learning and what we were then calling civically engaged scholarship? And Cheryl will remember this. Cheryl and Scott Wright were tasked with reviewing 54 different RPT documents. We gathered hard copies. I can remember those binders that you went through to see what were departments and colleges then saying about where they were placing service learning and community engaged scholarship in their RPT documents. We found in many cases that service learning was placed under service, and that might be one of the reasons we now call it community engaged learning, because service learning, which although in my view should have been under teaching, was being sort of shunted off into service. But we didn't find a lot in statements. There were a few shining stars at the time, and this is probably like 03, 04 in there. Ed leadership and policy, Parks, Rec, and tourism were using Ernst Boyer's Scholarship of Engagement, which a copy of whose most recent edition Keith has here. This is the expanded edition. He'll be talking about that. What Boyer did is he said there were four, he took the 3 legs of our mission, teaching, research, and service, and cast them into 4 areas, 4 forms of scholarship: discovery, integration, application, and teaching. And he argued that the academy needed to recognize all of these. Keith will be sharing more on that. And then there was more progress after this. Jim Anderson, as some of you may recall, wrote a white paper on community engaged scholarship. I believe that was presented to the academic senate. We, under the leadership of the Bennion Center, applied for and received the Carnegie classification. The university did, as an engaged campus. And so there was progress, and it was encouraging. But that took about, that's about a 10-year period there. But we were kind of swimming upstream, and some of you will remember Bernie Matchin when he was here as president. When we had our Civically Engaged Scholars Group meeting, and we were all excited, rah, rah, this is the wave of the future. Bernie essentially said to us, as he met with our group, he said, don't bother, it's not going to count. I mean, that's sort of like, what? But that was coming from the president of the university. And then we had a panel discussion once where a dean, no longer a dean, was at a panel discussion, not unlike this kind of panel discussion on community engaged scholarship, who basically said, and there were 2 of his tenure track faculty in the audience at the time, said, don't do it. Don't do it until you, don't waste your time on this. Wait till you're tenured. And then you can do whatever you want to do, and then you can do this kind of scholarship. So you can imagine how discouraging that was. So fall of '02, I have to go up for tenure. And I'm thinking, well, how am I going to do this when people are just starting to understand community engaged work and maybe not fully understand it? So I wrote, and I have a copy here, an 18-page tome essay. It's
pretty terrific.
It's a personal statement, but it was really kind of a narrative of my life, almost. And as I said, I kind of went out on a limb, and I said in my statement, I have chosen to present myself here as a quote-unquote civically engaged scholar, an identity which I believe is not only reflected in my research, teaching, and service, but which importantly allows me to integrate my scholarly activities in these critical areas. One of the things that I did, and it was important for me, was to do a little bit of educating my colleagues in the College of Social Work around this work. Some were familiar with it, but many were not. And so this personal statement turned into a literature review of sorts. And I have like 21 references at the end. I mean, how many of your personal statements have references? But I had to...
Only the lawyers.
Only. So I had to let people know that this was something that was a national movement, and I had to do a little bit of education. So that was the whole point. And I wrote, there was a section called, in my statement, called Scholarly Expression in the RPT Review Process. And I said, while more and more universities are beginning to address the scholarship of engagement in the RPT review process, at most institutions of higher learning there remains an emphasis on the more traditional and narrow conceptualizations of research, teaching, and service. And then I kind of went on. But I will say, if you're thinking of doing anything like this, it's important to align whatever your personal narrative or statement is with your current RPT guidelines in your department or your college. So one of the things I did in my statement, just so people would remember what our guidelines said, when I started each section on research, teaching, and service, I restated them at the very top. I said, this is what our statement says I need to do for tenure. And then I would go on and explain how I did them. I guess that's still part of education, because as many of you know, when you are, or not all colleges and departments, you're sitting around making tenure decisions, promotion and tenure decisions. Not everybody has a copy of those guidelines in front of you and are referring to them. I also presented a schema that Glassick et al. In 1997 had presented as a framework for this kind of work. And I tried to tie that framework to my own scholarship. And there are things like clear goals, adequate preparation, appropriate methods, significant results, effective presentation, reflective critique, and these were adopted by, at the time, the National Review Board for Scholarship and Engagement when they were trying to push these guidelines forward. So I'm here, so it worked, and I was promoted and tenured. So I've been serving for a number of years on the RPT Standards Committee, now the Senate Faculty Review Standards Committee, for about 8 years, and about 5 of those as chair. And so I've been able to watch progress in statements, moving to getting the language that we were looking for 10 years prior into these RPT statements. And we put a little bit in our social work statement, but I think looking at it now, it's kind of weak. We said the College of Social Work values collaborative, community-based research, CBR, and acknowledges that publications resulting from such research often involve multiple authors. And there were a couple departments and colleges that kind of picked up that language. And actually, this language is in the RPT template, which is we're asking all departments and colleges to use in forming their RPT guidelines. And there is language in sections where departments have the liberty to address their specific requirements. There is a section that deals with community-based research. But the best of the best, in my view, is in Cheryl's Department of Family and Consumer Studies. This is a statement that, a more recent statement approved last fall, which does a lot more than we did in our social work statement. And I'll just read a little bit about that, and then I think I'm going to be out of time. But they acknowledge that, that in the Department of Family and Consumer Studies, a diverse range of scholarly products is encouraged. They talk about the more traditional scholarly projects, of course, publications, books, and things. But they say some forms of scholarship encouraged by the department may yield innovative and high-quality scholarly products that go beyond traditional research outlets. To enhance engagement and impact, scholars may also create multimedia products or technological innovations, and they give examples, or contribute to entrepreneurial activities, and they give examples. And they say that assessments of faculty research in the RPT process should reflect the professional context of the candidate. And they say that the performance in all the areas, no matter what kind of research you're doing, more traditional, more community-based or engaged, that they're evaluated along 4 dimensions. And I think this is important, and I think Keith may talk more about this. 1, it has to be sustained with products at multiple stages of the research projects. 2, high in quality. 3, programmatic, in the sense that research efforts are focused on a coherent set of issues and result in cumulative knowledge. And 4, strongly indicative of intellectual independence. So this is one of the best statements that expands upon, if you're going to do community engaged scholarship, here's the rigor that will be expected when we review your file for retention, promotion, and tenure. So I think we've come a long way, and the fact that Ruth Watkins has formed this task force on community engaged scholarship, to me, as I look back 20 years, have we arrived? We have a president and a senior vice president now who I think are supportive of this work and are looking to see how do you, I don't know if catalog the word is, how do you catalog it, or how do you make it work in the RPT process here at the university? So I can retire in peace.
You don't get to retire. We've already talked about that.
All right. Well, thanks, Hank. Yeah, there's a wonderful segue to all sorts of parts I wanted to talk about today. So as Hank was just alluding to, Ruth Watkins has formed a task force to take a look at community engaged scholarship, and I'm pleased and honored to be chairing that. A number of you are actually in the audience that are on that committee. And I think where I'd start with is just kind of building off where Hank was. In putting the charge together, Ruth really raised some key instrumental type of questions toward this about, for instance, the first one is about documenting and measuring the impact. The community engaged scholarship very well might take different forms of documentation, and then what would be those metrics we take a look at. What are the best practices in the evaluation in faculty work? And I'll go a little bit deeper into that in a moment. And then questions about essentially, how do you measure specific dimensions? So again, kind of a metrics question on this. But really, if you peel back, and why I'm glad Hank mentioned Ernest Boyer's work, is I think if we really think about it for a moment, anytime we're dealing with the definition of scholarship, or as it's titled here, issues of retention, promotion, and tenure, the question that's being raised is, what kind of university do we want to be? It's at the heart of that. And so I think the best place to start is from Boyer. And so his very last sentence of his book, in terms of Scholarship Reconsidered, is to sustain the vitality of higher education in our time, a new vision of scholarship is required, one dedicated not only to the renewal of the academy, but ultimately to the renewal of society itself. So there's a mission statement in terms of what we're trying to think about in terms of scholarship broadly, and in this particular case, community engaged scholarship. And we're not the only ones wrestling with this. When we started the task force, it is a propitious time to be taking a look at this. So some of the things, some of the context that's being surrounding us in this conversation is we are a member of the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. And just this past August, so whatever that is, 5 months ago, something like that, released a report entitled The Centrality of Engagement in Higher Education. And the executive summary states, quote, "To thrive in the 21st century, higher education must move engagement from the margin to the mainstream in its research, teaching, and service work. To achieve transformational change in higher education by embedding engagement conceptually and as a practice, new approaches must be taken to thrive in the 21st century." So that's a gathering of universities we belong to. Another conversation that's parallel here is we are a member of Campus Compact, and President Pershing a while ago signed a statement that has put into action, as I understand it, the development of a campus civic action plan by 2017. And I think the work of our task force needs to be working with that effort as well. And then thirdly, we're a member of the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification. What's interesting there is some of the points that Ruth started with in terms of the charge to the committee are exactly issues that the Community Engagement Classification, the organization, maintains are issues that all of us are wrestling with. So assessment practices. Hank talked a little bit about the notion of reciprocity and mutuality with our community members. So what does that mean in terms of review and knowledge generation, and what community is important? And then another one is alignment with other campus priorities and initiatives. And I think that's a rich opportunity for us here at Utah if we take a look at our mission and our values and where community engagement may lie there. So I think it's a rich conversation. So in the task force, we've been talking about developing definition as we move through about what do we mean by community engagement, what do we mean by community engaged scholarship, and that conversation is still ongoing, and we're trying to address some of these key issues that Ruth has laid out, and just begun to break into groups to take a look at these issues of, what are the domains of impact and metrics that people are using out there. So rather than kind of report on kind of where the community is or the committee is and going, I'm going to take a leap on a couple of issues here and suggest to you some frameworks that might be useful or examples that might be useful in our conversations. So in terms of impact, what is interesting is, I think it was 2010, if I remember correctly, the UK higher education system went through this huge effort in terms of trying to document research productivity of faculty and these issues of impact. And rather than ask academics about it, they went out and hired the RAND Corporation to identify what are these areas. So whether or not that was the best approach, it is interesting to see the range that they came up with about domains of impact, and perhaps it enriches what we might think of, particularly as we engage with the community. So certainly they start off with what they call academic, we might call disciplinary impact. And clearly our scholarship can do that. The second is the impact through teaching, that do we demonstrate that students are actually the first and perhaps even engaged recipients of new knowledge, generators of knowledge. Policy impact is another domain that perhaps can be addressed. In some fields, the impact on practice could be a whole nother domain on which we take a look at this. So we can think about it in terms of training, our guidelines developed, ways of doing it, your procedures, if you will. And what that got me to think of is within the, my realm was architecture. So within the architecture realm, a piece that always kind of recurs to me in my mind is there's a piece on research utilization or scholarship utilization in architecture. And the person talks about how it can have actually a range of impacts, thinking of, or utilization, from instrumental. So here, this is, in our world, this is the kind of countertop perhaps you want in a hospital because it's less porous to microbial invasion, something like that, right? So, okay, so that's very instrumental. That's why you do that. But it can also be conceptual in nature. Does it reshape the way that we think about the problem? And I think there are things that are gained through community engagement that certainly are in that realm. They identify the idea of expert witness that begins to develop in that in terms of impact on practice. They throw in the category of impact on public knowledge creation. So it's not just knowledge generation in the discipline or in the academy, but knowledge creation in the public or the community. What begins to permeate the public discourse? Maybe another impact. And then certainly they talk about economic impacts that can happen. Interestingly enough, they divide that up. So direct economic impact, and that's things like, who did you hire, right? Or and what company might have spun off of it, things of that sort. And then economic impact on wider society. So I suppose that's more indirect kind of impacts. But here's this whole range of potentials of impact that scholarship and community engaged scholarship might begin to have. Then another issue is this idea of assessing it, and the idea of peer review, which often we rely on our disciplinary journals to make that judgment, right? So if it's assessed and accepted and published in whatever, a journal of high impact or what have you, it must be a good piece of work. There are other models that are being done out there, not necessarily with community engaged scholarship, although I'll start with one that is. So an example that's been developed is the community engaged scholarship for health. And if it's CES for health, for the number, health.info. And what they've done is developed a mechanism of peer review and dissemination through that organization. So if you're doing community engaged scholarship in health, there's a mechanism by which to submit your work, have it assessed by peers as another alternative to peer review. Something that we do often, something that we often do when we submit to, let's say, the National Science Foundation or things of grants, is we often have expert panels that assess. Is that an opportunity within community engaged scholarship, and what might be those expert panels to assess those? Then two others that were really interesting to me as thought-provoking. One is within ecological and evolutionary biology. There's this program that has started at, it's called peerageofscience.org. And what they're doing is they're having authors submit papers and receive reviews there, and then publishers look at the reviews there and then make offers to publish to those that submitted. So it's an interesting process. It's centralizing the review process, and then the publishers wrestle with that with the offers that they make. The reason I bring it up is it actually won the a 2012 Association of Learned and Professional Society of Publishers Awards for publishing innovation. So in other words, even in the publishing domain, they're taking a look at richer ways or alternative ways of thinking about peer review. And then one that's kind of similar to that is rubric.com, where you can submit something and then gain independent peer reviews in your area that are then portable, and you may send them to other journals. So there's another interesting model that I hadn't heard of before. So I think there are a number of ways in which to potentially be creative while staying within the spirit and the definitions that we typically have of scholarship, which Hank enumerated before. So those are kind of some of the things I would throw out as points of discussion. And Amy.
All right.
The closer.
The closer. No pressure.
No.
All right. So I think it might be helpful for me to spend just a little time explaining what I do in terms of the RPT process. Many of you know, but for the campus, so for the academic affairs colleges, I read all the files. I also have the great pleasure of reading all the health sciences files because we also review for the president. So I read every RPT file at this university. I know a lot of you are very jealous right now, thinking, wow, how could I do that? Because that sounds like fun. And one of the things that I have learned, right, in this process is that we do lots and lots of different kinds of work. I never thought that I would be trying to figure out, somebody's artwork and whether that constituted the kind of work that would give us a route to tenure, right? That's a little beyond what I thought I would be doing. But there are many, many different kinds of things that we do on this campus. So everything I'm going to say right now obviously will apply in different ways in different places. But the biggest thing for me in thinking about the RPT process is to go back to, Hank mentioned that he was the chair for a very long time, and let me thank you publicly for that service, for doing all of what you did to make that process so much better. But we have a committee, right, that has now a template that we provide to departments and colleges. Departments and colleges, though, are the ones that are drafting these documents. So there's some sort of centralized stuff that happens that are that is built into the template, if you will. But much of this is going to be up to departments or colleges to determine. So the first thing we have to understand is that it's never going to work for the senior vice president or the president to say, today we will all value community engaged scholarship in X way, whatever way you want to do it, right? That is in fact, in my relatively limited experience, that is the one way I can guarantee that every department on this campus will reject it. That has been my experience, right? If we say, you're going to do this, everybody says, oh, no, we're not. Let me tell you how many different ways we're not going to do that, right? So we have tried a different approach. Again, using the template, using flexibility, giving people examples, and then coming up with strategies that might help better inform folks about issues. So one of the things that the task force is working on, as we just heard, is how to think about scholarship. What do we do with community engaged scholarship? How do we evaluate that? Let's get some metrics all out there and let's get them around to everyone so that folks can start to think about this. Now what this really means is that this is also a slow process. So we might be getting there, Hank, but it tends to be a slow process. We have to let this sort of percolate through to get everybody at the table to start thinking about it. But again, we're trying what we can to support this because what I will say very clearly is that the president and the senior vice president, not saying don't waste your time on this, right? We're saying this is a value to us. We want to bring it into everybody's sort of field of vision, and we want to think about how we can do that effectively. So I think on the scholarship front, the task force is really coming up with some great stuff in thinking about how everybody can understand community engaged scholarship. I think the difficulty for me is that we often have this world between scholarship and then the other stuff that you do in community engagement, which mostly gets shoved into service, right? So it's like you've got just two choices. You publish the work, however we define, right, the scholar. I'm gonna call it published work. Published work we can put in the scholarship bucket. And by and large, I have to say, that is not as controversial as you might imagine it to be by the time it gets to my level. We can talk about individual experiences, but by the time it gets to my level, that's not as controversial. What is controversial, right, is that I did all of this community engaged work. It doesn't result in published work, but we're just shoving it into service. And if we think about the hierarchy in terms of RPT, research is here, right? We have to be excellent or effective in research. You have to be excellent or effective or some combination, right, in teaching. And then what do we require for service? Just effective, right? You can be excellent. Thank you very much for your excellent service, right? But all you have to meet is effective. So I think what people might struggle with in some circumstances is trying to figure out why is it that community engagement is so devalued if we're just putting a lot of it into this service category that isn't as weighty, if you will, in the RPT process. And I get that concern. So this isn't to take away from any of the scholarship stuff, but that is to say there's only so much of this that will be solved in thinking about scholarship. I think there's a whole other part of this that I'm hearing from people, and that is I do a whole bunch of community engagement stuff. It's really, really important stuff. It's really valuable to the university, and you're putting it in service, right? I might as well not do it. Okay, so what do I have a solution for you? I do! I wouldn't have come today if I didn't have a solution, and I'm so happy my friend Wendy is here because you're gonna help me. You didn't know this. So here you go. Oh, yay! On the spot. What? All right, so I've been thinking a lot about this, and of course, I come from the law school, which is why we can make fun of all the lawyers. And then, you know, over in the School of Medicine, I was thinking about this as well. And they have, the School of Medicine has very recently revised their RPT standards. And one of the things that catches your eye is that over in the School of Medicine, there aren't 3 areas that are evaluating teaching, research, and service, but there is a 4th. And the 4th area is the clinical practice advancement. That is to say that instead of a 3-legged stool, there is a 4-legged stool. Now, it doesn't apply for everyone, right? So we can think about that. But I think the more general concept that I'm thinking about in this space is to say, is there room for us to think of community engaged work in a very different way than we have in the past? And maybe, just maybe, we have some models for doing this. And I'd like to suggest that the School of Medicine, in thinking about their clinical practice, which we all know also helps out their healthcare operation, right, which is very, very important and brings in lots of revenue for the university. But it might offer us an idea of how we might think about valuing community engaged work. That is, we could think about this as a practice kind of thing and not just say, oh, there's only 2 alternatives. You got to have this published work or you shove it over here into service, which again, I really value everybody's service. I don't want anybody to think I'm not somebody who wants to serve. But in the RPT process, right, it doesn't get valued as highly. So could we imagine another way, right, a 4th leg where we thought about where it was appropriate, the practice sort of things that people go out and do in community engagement. And again, we have a model that we could draw on. Now, where would we align this in the stars of RPT, right? One thing we have to understand, as a research university, everybody here knows we are never going to devalue the research part of the RPT equation. In fact, if anything, it only goes up, right? We only demand more over time. All of you know, like, you know, if I go back and talk to people at the law school, they'll say, oh, you know, I didn't have to publish nearly as much as you all have to publish, right? That's just sort of how the world works in terms of the research side of this equation. And as a representative, right, for the senior vice president, I have to say to all of you, that will always be very highly valued, right? But could we imagine, if we think about teaching and where teaching is on that, teaching has a different kind of impact, right? Could practice or work, right, this engaged work, occupy a similar kind of space as teaching, which again is very, very important, more important, relatively speaking, right, than service, so that we have a different kind of emphasis. I think this is very possible, and I think this is something that we could think about, right, as we think about how we might consider community engagement in the RPT process. So with that very provocative idea, I will just leave it there. How's that? And then we'll just open it up to discussion.
Let's thank our panelists, please. And I'm sure you have some burning questions.
Oh, no, we've answered it all. Okay.
I had a comment about Amy's last comment, which is, why are we okay? I had a comment about Amy's last comment, which is, why are we okay devaluing service? Why are we going to accept that?
So I think the question here is sort of, would the better strategy be to require excellence in service as opposed to maybe coming up with something that would be a practice, fourth leg of the stool, right? We certainly could do that. Here would be my concern. I mean, we could go that route. That's another possibility. You could change the standard so that you would require excellent service. The issue for me is that service, of course, is lots of different things. So it's service on university committees and college committees, on department committees. It's your professional service out there in the world, right? And so it's almost like we have all these different ways, and then public service, community service. So you have 3 different things that you're trying to put into that category. So I suppose we could say, yeah, let's change that standard. But I just think it might not get us as far as we want, because again, within those 3 categories, okay, so now we change it to excellent. So maybe places just say your professional service is the most important, and we'll give you excellent as far as that goes. It just doesn't seem to hit the right note for me in sort of addressing the community engagement issue. But we could. I mean, it's certainly an option of what we could do.
There are, I'll just throw this out, there are institutions that divide it just like you said, that have the scholarship, teaching, and service, and in service you have to define it between institutional, disciplinary.
Ours does that. Ours
Oh,
does
okay.
that. Yeah, ours does that.
And then
But what I'm saying is that's an overall rating for service. And so if you think you're solving it by putting excellence in service, okay, so does it mean excellence in all 3? No, it just means you get some combination thereof, right? Yeah, Wendy. Oh, yeah.
So
Wendy wants
Wendy's got it. Okay, I'll follow Wendy.
I guess I'll also just say, because I was part of the, and we actually don't call it RPT anymore in the School of Medicine.
That's right.
We call it FARA.
FARA.
So Faculty Appointment, Review, and Advancement, because not everybody, the majority of our faculty are not on the tenure line. Most of them are on the career line, myself included. But the issue with the clinical area that we defined, we really had to struggle in terms of what would define excellence in clinical. And the clinical, it was not just being a good provider, it was actually advancing the science of medicine and practice. So it would be writing practice guidelines, disseminating your knowledge to others related to your clinical practice. So I think that's an important thing. It's not just saying, hey, you're a good doctor, you get good patient ratings. You guys know all of our ratings are on the web. It's not that. It's a higher level of practice that you can consider as in the excellence category. So just to kind of clarify it, I think maybe that elevates it. We still kind of kept service and administration as a bottom support for the 3 other in our minds.
I think the other thing that I'll say just in response to the service question, there are not many universities that require excellence in service. So we might also think about it in terms of how we would want to position ourselves when we recruit new faculty members, or we think how other reviewers are looking at what we do. Again, I don't know exactly what the answer would be, but it would be different for people to get standards that say we require excellence in service. That's just not what the norm is. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. I can't even remember where I read this, but the university has changed their mission statement.
Yep.
So I mean,
It's now readable.
What?
It's now readable. You will read it.
But didn't they add innovation and?
We did. Yeah.
So is there any way that, in connection to the university mission statement, there might be an in for the kind of work that we do? Most of us are doing very innovative community work, and it's.
I mean, I guess what I would say to all of this is, what is
one of the core commitments.
Yeah, it's one of the core commitments. I mean, what is the real purpose of the mission statement? Is the real purpose of the mission statement to embrace sort of, in a very generic way, try to embrace everything that we do here, right? In a form that is readable. That was the hope, right? It wasn't 3 pages long, which was what we used to have, and nobody knew what our mission statement was. We respond, by the way, the backstory on the mission statement is that we had the accreditation team here, and they said, your mission statement has nothing to do with all the rest of the stuff that you're, and we just hadn't, done any revision. So what we really tried to do is match up our mission statement to all of the sort of dialogues and things like that that we had before this, that led to the 4 big goals and the core commitments, et cetera. So that's what we did. Did I do okay? Okay, so that's all we did in sort of revising it, and to try to come up with something that, again, was at a very generic level, you could connect to it. But I think when you think about sort of how do we value these things, there's so many different signals for value. I certainly don't think that it has to be in just a FARA or RPT statement where we're doing this. Obviously, there has to be a lot more to say that we value this. But it seems to be... it seems to hold a particular place in the line of symbolism for us to have these kinds of things in the RPT document, which is, we could talk about why that is, but it's sort of like, if it's in the RPT document, then it's something, right? Then it means something. I don't know if that doesn't have to be the case, but that's how people see it symbolically.
I like your provocative idea.
Okay, thank you.
So could I just say that from where I sit, for as long as I've sat here, when you say that research will always be, it's just getting higher and higher, you just kept mentioning publishing. And one of the problems, I think, is such a narrow focus that research means peer-reviewed articles in high-impact journals with a high H factor, or whatever it's called, H index. And we've forgotten Boyer, and we have to think of scholarship in a much larger frame work. We have to think about innovation. We have to think about impact. And this is where I get so hung up. And let me just read this again from Family and Consumer Studies, because I didn't read it all. They recognize more traditional scholarly products, publication of original research papers in referee journals and conference proceedings, publication and research monographs, book chapters, book reviews, presentations. But they say some forms of scholarship encouraged by the department, for example, policy analysis, program evaluation, translational research, participatory action research, or community engaged research, may yield innovative and high quality scholarly products that go beyond traditional research outlets. To enhance engagement and impact, scholars may also create multimedia products or technological innovations, for example, software, videos, and exhibitions with associated commentary, or contribute to entrepreneurial activities, for example, partnering with nonprofit organizations to advance scholarship or scholarly products. That's scholarship writ large. And until we get away from this notion that the coin of the realm is publications, peer-reviewed and high-impact journals, are we going to make much progress?
So the first thing I'd say is that we would not make any progress if we say that we are going to devalue those other traditional outlets. So I think what we don't want to do is say those aren't going to be valuable.
Make
so we
room,
have to start,
but make room for other
and I will say
scholarly
again,
products.
I have seen lots of other scholarly products that have been valued, and I said, I believe my definition was published work. So published work, right, is sort of how I imagine this, and this is how, and so have I seen from different places, computer science, et cetera, like sort of software things, We certainly have seen that, and we've certainly been able to evaluate that in the context of the right kinds of department guidelines, right? I think that the question is, what is going to be, what we count as scholarship? This is what the task force is spending so much time really coming up with good metrics. But I'm also here to say that my amicus brief at the Supreme Court, Keith's already heard, my amicus brief at the Supreme Court, which is going to change the law, which it did, right? That's actually true. That's a true story. Because you all care so deeply about administrative law. I can tell. I will tell you all about. No, I'm just kidding. So my amicus brief on behalf of law professors is not scholarship. It's just not.
Well, what if your RPT guideline said it was?
Well, now we're just making stuff up,
No.
right? But, the answer is, right, well, what if we called a now you're talking to the right person, because lawyers like to call apples oranges. I mean, this is what we teach. This is what I'll go teach in just a few minutes. But I'm here to say, right, the amicus brief on behalf of law professors that goes, that is not, it's not traditional scholarship. It's also not scholarship. It's advocacy work that I am doing that it certainly embraces my scholarship, right? But does that mean that there isn't a place? So if I don't call that scholarship, which I'm going to tell you I would not call that scholarship, is there room for that to be counted in a different way? And my suggestion is there is a space for that, and it's not just shoved into service. Now, if Keith's committee comes up with a definition that tells me my amicus brief, then I'm in. But
could departments and colleges carve out, if it's not clinical practice, a fourth leg of the stool?
Yeah.
Now it's a chair.
I know.
That defines how they see that, something between the research and the services, and call it something, I don't know, impact innovation or something.
I am certainly open on the title, but I think it's essentially, for me, it's coming after this. It's the same thing, whether you want to call it community engaged work or practice work or what. You are doing this for a specific, you're doing a specific kind of work that may not result in the kind of scholarship that would qualify for the definition, right? But it's really important, it's impactful, and we want to acknowledge that experience or that what has happened within that.
I think another way of framing it is using the second big goal, the discover and transfer new knowledge, because that transfer of new knowledge might occur through changed practices
Right.
or traditions. It doesn't necessarily need to occur through published work, but that way, that's a way of anchoring it in the big goals of the university, and it gives you something to sort of hang the analysis on. But just an idea.
Keith, do you want to comment on any of this in terms of the task force?
In terms of the task force, well, like I said, we just kind of split up into some working groups this morning, a couple hours ago, taking a look at some of these ideas of areas of impact, what the metrics would be, different domains like that. Actually, since there's a number of committee members here, what would be things you might want to highlight as well in terms of where we're at in this conversation, if anything?
So who's on the committee?
I'd like to, I'm still kind of confused with regards to what are examples of community engagement. I've been, what I think, been doing community engaged learning in some of my classes, but the projects that I work on doesn't sound like they're going to count for what we're discussing here. For example, I work with a nonprofit, Ray Swami, and my students help design a come to the university day on a Saturday. What kind of tangible product is there other than the pamphlets that we
see? It may not constitute scholarship. Again, sort of like as you go through the list.
But you're saying put it in the other category as community engagement. And how does that?
So right now the choice is it goes in scholarship or it goes over here in service.
Yeah, right.
Right. And so all I'm proposing is that there's something that's in between there that's different than what we have now. So if people like that idea and we were to adopt that idea, all of which takes time and we would have to think about, right? But if we did that, I imagine that kind of work would be acknowledged in that category.
And so it'd be separate from the teaching and the
Correct.
scholarship?
Correct.
And one of the interesting things is if you actually look into the literature on the community engaged scholarship, there are actually definitions you can find which would suggest it needs to cut across all three, teaching, research, and service. So in some ways, it's even a narrower definition that you need to be doing these three activities within the singular community engaged effort. So, so I think that's why we're spending so much time on kind of, what are we really talking about here when we use the phrase community engagement, community engaged scholarship, and so forth, and maybe community engaged practice.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the idea of trying to place value on more pieces. I think the concern it raises for me is that we're dividing things up even more. And my impression, and clearly it's different across disciplines, is that what community engaged scholarship as a field has taught us is that these things are far more related than we've thought in the past. And so I worry about deciding that pieces of community engagement, that if we define scholarship very limited to the products of scholarship, as opposed to the process of scholarship, we may or may not have yet produced something, that we might start missing things. So I'll give an example. I was meeting with someone yesterday, a faculty member, who's working with a student who's doing some community engaged work and has a lot of relationships. And because of those relationships, the faculty and student were able to, through a class, do some community engaged research based on those relationships, which would have taken a long time to build. So the community engagement with the schools, which was not intended to produce research outcomes, then was worked into even other people's scholarly work. And so one thing I think we may want to think about is, instead of trying to divide it up more, think more of the spectrum of activities that are involved in scholarship. Certainly an important one is products that can be shared, but you can also evaluate and report on relationships built, projects done, and I even think it could be helpful for us, so to use your amicus brief example, you could think of that as separate from your scholarship. But what would happen if you thought of it as part of your scholarship, as a continuum of products, assuming it's based on work that you're doing through research? And then if you think of it that way, not only is your research feeding into it and it's one version of a product that maybe more people are going to read than your journal article, how do you then say, well, if this is scholarship I'm doing, how can I then learn from what happens with this amicus brief and bring that back in? How do people respond to it? So just, I worry that we lose that continuum nature of this work that touches teaching, that touches research in ways that aren't just the product of research.
So I kind of had a different view before I heard Hank talk, and I thought it was really interesting. I thought that perhaps the Academy should respond to us as researchers and your discussion about the way that you thought about how to frame yourself within the broader construct that exists as it exists as a large institution with standards and how you have to scale that. I thought it was really nice to hear that what you did is you used the tools and the strategies and the structure to really frame where you sat in that. And thinking about how your scholarship cut across these different bins, but you provided a way for an external reviewer to look at it, to be educated about it, to see the value of it, and to see how it was contemporary and very valuable to the institution. And so then as a reviewer, it's sort of like, oh, yeah, great. While it doesn't necessarily fit into these boundaries that we've established as a large group, I see the impact and the value of this, and certainly we need to keep this person around to do that. So I wonder if in part of this discussion too, in just recently going through this entire process, that we might think about mentoring or helping individuals go through that to help frame themselves into this broader institution and departments and sort of mission and all of this, to really, make the case, because it was sort of, indicated that that's what we should do, but I never had thought about it in that particular way, especially when you're doing something that hopefully is at a little bit of the fringe of what is normal. So thanks. That was really helpful.
Yeah, and I had a mentor, Marshall Welch, who was a professor in special education and came over and served 6 years in the Bennion Center, helped me with that statement and told me to talk about the way you're integrating your teaching, your research, and your service, but be sure that you pay attention to your current RPT guidelines, because that's what your external evaluators, that's what your faculty are going to be looking at. So Marshall had a huge hand in helping me craft that statement and review it and give me feedback. So yeah, the whole mentoring thing was important. And you know, this National Review Board, I don't even know if it still exists, for the scholarship of engagement. It's sort of one of like the things you talked about, a central place where if you are a community engaged scholar, you would send your file off to this review board and they would give you feedback. We might need something like that within the university. Maybe it can grow out of the task force where, okay, if this is the rubric, these are the metrics we're expecting, then have a group of mentors where people could send drafts of their personal statements and files for guidance and input. I think it's a great idea.
Just going through that process, that would be so hugely beneficial, because the framing of where you place yourself is critical, and you get very little input. And you know, and Pat and I've kind of discussed this, kind of throwing this stuff over a fence and hoping that you hit the mark. And sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And because it has such a large impact on your career and other things, that it really seems that a bit of mentoring and a bit of support in that would be helpful.
Yeah. And RPT, it's a lonely process, but it shouldn't be.
And it varies widely by departments. And I should also say that most deans, not these two deans sitting here, are actually quite sensitive to the question of whether they are properly mentoring people within their units, because I'm going to tell you what all of them say, right? That they do, in fact, not these two, right? They do everything that they're supposed to be doing. They're coaching you on how you're supposed to approach these things, right? So we do some other sort of more gentle things, like I do a couple of presentations. We have a new pilot program that we're running for mentoring in humanities next year, where we're going to try to do more of this, but also understand that most people believe that everybody's getting that mentoring, right? And so it probably is important for us to also have some folks that'll be willing to stand up and say, maybe I'm not getting that. Maybe that's not happening in the way that I think it could.
Well, I think sometimes what happens is we confuse the verb with the noun in terms of mentoring. So
Yeah.
we assume, oh, they have a mentor,
Yeah.
so they're receiving mentoring.
Yeah.
Well, that may not be the case.
Well, we're really exploring this idea of having people who are not within your unit, not within your department, or even in your college, as providing more support.
We call those MINOs, mentor in name only.
Oh, there we go. I like it.
So one thing I will say, I was at a conference in DC before the big snowstorm, the week before, social work research conference, and we went to a presentation on the presentation was called Using Community-Based Participatory Research to Adapt a Culturally Grounded Prevention Curriculum for Urban American Indian Parents, funded by the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. And I think one of the reasons community engaged scholarship is coming to the fore is that grantors, including federal grants, NIH, are recognizing CBPR, and this was a randomized control trial. 300 families in the control group, 300 in the treatment group. Just really solid research. You know, traditional. It's community-based, but it's traditional. And I think many grantors are expecting to see some kind of community engagement piece in your grants. So if you're doing this work, there is opportunity to do this kind of research. And more people are funding it, which is great. We've come a long way.
Yeah, I was just gonna, when Jim made his comment, I thought of how fascinating this discussion is, because, and it's such a treat, because both Hank and Amy are talking about the rules of promotion and tenure. but two very different takes on it, right? Hank made the case within the rules, and Amy is saying, I don't think what I did, the amicus brief again, fits under this, and so I'm not going to make that case. So she's leaving it alone.
It's not that I think, I actually know. And the answer is, it's not.
It's
so,
not.
Sorry, it's because that's what I do.
Right, but the rules are made up. I mean,
Right.
it's a social construction. We could change that.
And that's what I do for a living is
Right,
rules.
right.
So we're
Right.
getting into some really tricky territory.
Right.
So
But you also said that if the committee, the task force, were to make it so an amicus brief were scholarship, you'd be thrilled.
I think this is like, if tomorrow you can, turn like my healthy dinner into a chocolate cake and it counts the same, wow, who doesn't love that? But I think the point is that when we think about what is scholarship, there are a lot of things that are going to go into that, right? And it's really important, again, that the task force has come up with some very measurable ways. I mean, look, the amicus brief is not, because it's advocacy, it's very clear in my world what that is, so I'm sorry if that doesn't work for everybody else. But I think that what Hank's bringing up are the more novel things, software, other sort of display things, right? What can we do with those? When we think about how you're going to manage those, again, I think having guidelines from a task force are really important. But the answer is that each of the disciplines is going to apply this the way that it fits in their discipline. And the answer is that the amicus brief is not going to be scholarship in the law school. I mean, it's just not. And again, it's not for, this isn't like, I mean, we could have there are a lot of things that law faculty won't agree on. This one, I think we could have them all here. So the question is, again, for me, we're not going to mess with what is, that sort of big piece of what is scholarship, what is research. We come up with some good guidelines about what that is. Each discipline translates that into what we count as scholarship, thinking about expansively in different ways, which we have already done, not in the community engaged space necessarily, but in other ways. Like I really have School of Computing people who are getting tenure based on software that they've created, right? Like that's a thing that happens. So this isn't so novel in that sense. Again, we have artists that are getting tenured on displays of photographs. Right? Like there's a lot of ways we can think about this. Again, going to get translated. But my point is, not everything in community engagement is going to be scholarship. What we have to understand, like it's just not. So once we get to that point, and we can debate for a long time about the scholarship, then we need to say, what do we do with the rest of it? Is the rest of it not valuable? Or do we just put it into service, which is a little bit like saying it's not as valuable? Or do you want to have something else? That to me is the question.
Well, but I don't want to lose the point that Jim was making, which is something we're doing at the Bennion Center is coming up with some generally accepted civic competencies that we want students to develop as they go through programming, as they matriculate through college. But the most important piece of it is to ask them to defend their civic competencies, to make the case for why they felt they've achieved a civic competency. And I like that part of the promotion and tenure process, that the faculty members should be making the case. And you can choose not to make the case for the amicus brief, but I would love to see a place in an institution where the review committee, the faculty evaluation committee, the promotion and tenure committee would be open to someone making the case for the amicus brief in this case, but for whatever product or whatever piece of scholarship they feel strongly
I got to
about.
push back too, because I think what you're also, we have to be really careful about this too. I would hate for people to spend 7 years of their lives working on amicus briefs or advocacy, representing parties, come to find out in year 7, well, you didn't make the argument very well and you're not getting tenure. So I have to put the brakes on. Like I kind of have to say to everybody, that's a bad strategy. Like you don't necessarily want to do it that way. I think what I heard Hank say was that you make your best case, that your work is fitting in those guidelines, knowing that you're having a conversation, an ongoing conversation with your department, with your unit about the kind of work you do and how it fits into those guidelines. If you get a very clear signal, again, sorry, we're using the amicus brief, but everybody understands that an amicus brief is not going to be counted as scholarship, it is a really bad bad idea to just keep saying it is scholarship, right? I am going to have people fail in the tenure process. I don't want that. I don't want anybody failing in the tenure process, right? That's not my goal. So I do think that we have to be really careful. It is the case that we want everybody to make their very best argument, and their personal statement should reflect all the best of what they do. But you have to be cautious, and I'm going to say, don't spend 7 years doing something that is not going to be valued. It's going to be problematic, and that is not a day I want to see.
I just have a question, kind of regards to, so we've talked a lot about rules and bodies or entities that are kind of the gatekeepers in this process. So I was just curious, in terms of implementation of change, like adding a fourth leg on the, or now it's a chair.
Or putting just the language in from FCS's statement or something like that.
So within each, because I mean, I don't have the depth of experience as the folks in this room, but I know that there are departments, within each department has its own kind of power structure and different kind of mores towards community engagement and what classifies. So there's some departments like more medical related that might be more open to this idea of of practice, but there's other departments that because of the given structures that are created, that
is there anybody from chemistry? Should we pick chemistry? Anybody from chemistry?
Pick anybody.
Chemistry? Yeah, I'll just pick chemistry. It might be harder in chemistry, is what you're saying.
So it might be harder in different, so if the level of change is at the department level, how do you address the inequity in power structures within different, so you even make these guidelines. Some departments are going to be more open to adopting them than others. And so if you can't have President Pershing saying, I'm going to put my foot down and this is what's going to happen, how do you still empower faculty that are struggling to make the case, or to create, or not even make the case, but to change the structures within the department? Do I make sense in my question? Okay.
I think there are a lot of complicated problems here, right? So we would, I think over time, right, again, in my experience, the top-down approach is not the one that works. Getting support for ideas, building a task force, building a committee, giving people templates, to give all the people the signals, right, that this is a value and it's important, is the way to start that conversation. And it takes a long time, perhaps forever, right, to get everybody to think about this. But you have some leaders, you have people go out, you have certain departments that are very successful. They show, you can have a demonstration, right, hey, this doesn't kill you, and it actually makes it better, right? You start seeing value in that. The president or the senior vice president acknowledges the value of that, right? Again, does this take time? Do I know how to persuade everybody in the room? Nope, but I can probably talk you to death, right? And then maybe that'll do it. No, I'm just kidding. But I do think, there's no magic bullet here. Things will change over time. You'll get new people in. As you hire people in and you think about what the values are for those people, might it be important not to have sort of a pulse on this, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things that sort of transform units. Doesn't usually happen quickly in my experience, and it never happens as quickly as you'd like it to. But we can only do so much, right? And we're trying to do those kinds of things.
We have time for one last question.
Oh, no. I'm just kidding.
What's your, you have your charge, you've got subgroups. What's your timeline? And when will you have your report and recommendations done? What are you looking at?
It's supposed to be this semester.
Oh, great.
And then I think there's a phase that'll come after that. But for this task force, it's this semester. This semester, if I didn't pronounce it that way. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, the very slow process of revising standards, we should say, just so everybody knows, what is the usual schedule for people to review their standards? I think we tried to get everybody to think about it at least every 5 years. Most of the standards are a lot older than 5 years old.
We've made a dent.
Yes.
We're trying to get on a 7-year cycle, which coincides with your graduate council reviews, because they look at your RPT documents. But there are some that are out there from maybe the late 80s.
He said late 80s.
Early
he
90s.
just said late 80s.
The
So
1880s.
yeah, and we hope that the template will make this a much faster process.
Well,
but
and it could be, I foresee, possibly changes to this template, depending on what Keith's task force comes up with, so that there's more clarity in the template of the kinds of things you'll want to be sure to include if you're going to. Not all departments are going to hold up community engaged scholarship, like chemistry, but those that do.
which doesn't mean we don't love chemistry.
Yeah,
Just means
but
it's
those that
different.
do will have a rubric or some guidelines
Yep.
that can, and we can put that in as an example into the template. The template isn't the rule, Chris. It's not like there's a lot of things highlighted in yellow throughout the template, particularly around research and creative activity, and that's where we ask departments and colleges to come up with their take or approach on research and scholarship, and to be creative. And Family and Consumer Studies has done a wonderful job with that.
Hank, I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind sending or sharing what your group that met every week to define, community engagement and so forth, because I think that would be helpful in terms of history here, but also what we're doing in the task force.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all I have is a definition. I don't.
Well, that's good. I mean, where we started off was there was a task force that finished up, I think it was 2011, and we started off with that definition. But this is even earlier, so.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll see what I can find. I don't know that I have a lot of notes or anything, but I can send you the definition, which, as I reread it, I kind of liked it, because it talked about impact and partnership and collaboration, which is sort of at the essence of this work that we do, or those who do it.
Let's thank our panelists once again for their thoughtful reflections. And please join me again in thanking Pat and CTLE for the wonderful space and the lunch. And a couple of quick final reminders. If your schedule permits, there is a survey for feedback inside your program. You can either give it to me today or send it via campus mail. My address is on the survey. And there is an informal brown bag at the Bennion Center on Wednesday, March 9th from noon to 1, and our public service professor for the year, Juan Carlos Claudio, will be talking about his work this year in dance, Parkinson's disease, and community engagement. Thank you again for attending.
Thanks,